There's a strange thing about Thanksgiving. We all gather around the same table year after year, seeing the same faces. But beneath the surface, hidden in the cracks of those warm smiles and cheerful toasts, there's always something unspoken, something lurking. It might be an argument no one dares to bring up, a memory buried so deep it feels like a ghost in the room, or that one family member you can't quite trust. And sometimes, it's more than just a feeling. Tonight, I want to tell you about the Thanksgivings no one likes to talk about. The kind that makes the air feel heavier and the night feel colder. The kind that leaves you staring into the dark long after the candles have burned out. These are the stories of families torn apart, of whispers that never fade, and of truths so dark they were never meant to be revealed. Are you ready? Growing up, Thanksgiving was always spent at my grandparents' house. It was cozy, traditional, and familiar, the kind of place that never changed. The same turkey recipe, the same mismatched china, the same smell of cinnamon and pumpkin pie wafting through the air. I loved it. Until last year, I was 13, and my cousin Ellie and I had decided we were too old to sit around and listen to the adults talk about the good old days. We wanted adventure, or at least a little mystery. That's when Ellie suggested we go to the basement. I remember how casually she said it, like it was no big deal. But for me, the basement always felt off. It was dark, cold, and cluttered with forgotten things. My grandparents never went down there, or so they claimed. Still, I didn't want to seem scared, so I followed her. The basement was even creepier than I remembered. The single bulb barely lit the room, leaving shadows to stretch and dance on the walls. Ellie was already rifling through boxes when I noticed something strange: the smell. It was faint, metallic, like rust or blood. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then we found the journal. It was old, the leather cover cracked and brittle. It was tucked behind a stack of dusty board games, like someone had tried to hide it. Ellie opened it first, and her face went pale. "Look at this," she whispered, handing it to me. The handwriting was messy, hurried, and the entries were chilling. They started off normal mentions of family dinners, gardening, the weather, but then they turned dark. One entry caught my eye. "She won't stop crying. I don't know what to do. It was an accident, wasn't it?" Another said, "The noise is getting louder. I think she's angry." I could feel my heart racing as I read it. Who was this about? That's when the temperature seemed to drop. I felt a cold draft brush past me, but there was no vent or open window. Ellie looked at me, wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I hadn't, but then it came again, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on the stairs. We froze, staring at each other, then at the staircase leading up to the kitchen. Nobody was there. At least, nobody we could see. We wanted to leave, but curiosity kept pulling us back. We flipped through more pages, piecing together a fragmented story of guilt and loss. The final entry was smudged, but we could make out one word, written over and over again. When we showed the journal to my grandmother later that night, her reaction was instant. She turned pale, her hand trembling as she gripped the book. "Where did you find this?" she demanded. When we told her, she broke down, sobbing. Through her tears, she admitted something I'll never forget. "I lost a child long before you were born. It was an accident. I swear it was an accident." But the way she said it, it didn't sound like she believed her own words. Ellie and I were too stunned to respond. My grandmother stood up suddenly, wiping her eyes, and left the room. That's when we heard it again, banging. This time, it was loud, deliberate, coming from the basement. My grandfather grabbed a flashlight and rushed to check, but the banging stopped as soon as he opened the door. He found nothing. The basement was empty except for the boxes we'd moved earlier. And the journal? Gone. My grandmother couldn't explain what had happened. She only said, "Some things are better left buried." Ellie and I didn't sleep that night. Every little creak and groan of the old house felt amplified, like someone or something was moving around. We never found the journal again, and my grandmother refused to talk about that night. But every Thanksgiving after, I couldn't help but notice the way she glanced at the basement door, like she was waiting for something, or someone. To this day, I wonder what really happened. Was it an accident, or was it something more? And was the banging that night just the house settling, or the restless spirit of the child she lost? I guess I'll never know. Thanksgiving on our family farm was always quiet, peaceful. Just a small gathering of close relatives, good food, and hours of laughter. It was our tradition, and I never imagined anything could change that. But that year, I invited someone new, my college roommate, Mark. He didn't have anywhere to go for the holiday, and I thought I was doing a good thing, bringing him into our family's warmth. I still remember the way he looked when I picked him up. His clothes were clean, but disheveled, like he'd been wearing them for days. He barely said a word on the drive to the farm, just sat staring out the window with this distant expression. I figured he was just nervous or shy. I was wrong. From the moment Mark stepped inside, the energy in the house felt different. The dog, Buddy, normally friendly to everyone, growled low when Mark walked past. My mom brushed it off as the dog being protective, but I could see the unease in her eyes. And then there was Mark himself. He was polite but distant, barely engaging with anyone. When he wasn't staring out the window, he was mumbling to himself, just under his breath, words I couldn't quite make out. That night, strange things started happening. The door to Mark's room creaked open on its own, even though we'd made sure it was latched. Buddy refused to go near that part of the house, and when I went to check on Mark, I found him sitting on the bed, staring at a wall. He didn't even look at me when I asked if he was okay. He just said, "I shouldn't have come," and closed the door in my face. The next day was Thanksgiving, and things only got worse. My mom found the pantry door wide open that morning, all the canned goods knocked over. She blamed Buddy, but he'd been locked in the den all night. At dinner, Mark barely touched his food. Instead, he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to be standing there. Then there was the carving. We found it the next morning, etched deep into the surface of our dining table. A strange symbol, almost like an eye, with jagged lines radiating from the center. My dad was furious, accusing Mark of vandalizing the table. But Mark wasn't there to defend himself. He was gone. His bag, his coat, everything just gone. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. We searched the property, but there was no sign of him. My parents thought he'd left in the night, embarrassed or ashamed. But I wasn't so sure. Later that evening, I remembered a story my grandfather used to tell us about the uninvited guest. He said that, every so often, someone would show up at a family's door around Thanksgiving. They'd seem normal at first, but over time, strange things would happen. And when they left, they'd leave something behind, something that couldn't be undone. I never believed those stories. Until now. That night, the house felt different, too quiet, too still. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. It started softly at first, like someone knocking on the walls. Then it grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the house. My parents thought it was the wind, but I knew better. Buddy was hiding under my bed, shaking, his tail tucked between his legs. I decided to check Mark's room one last time. The door was ajar, and the air inside was freezing, even though the heat was on. His bed was neatly made, but something caught my eye, a bag tucked underneath. When I pulled it out, my stomach dropped. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. They were all of us, me family and me, sitting at the table, working in the yard, even sleeping. And the creepiest part? Some of them had been taken days before Mark even arrived. We burned the bag and the photos that night, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The banging continued for weeks, always at night, always coming from different parts of the house. My parents swore they saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching the house. But every time they looked again, the figure was gone. We never heard from Mark again. I tried searching for him online, calling friends we had in common, but it was like he'd vanished. And every Thanksgiving since, we can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. My grandfather's story wasn't just a legend, it was a warning. And now, we live with the reminder, carved into our table and etched into our memories. It all started when my family inherited the old mansion from a distant relative. The estate was enormous, perched atop a hill, surrounded by snow-covered trees that looked like they were frozen in time. My parents thought it was the perfect place to spend Thanksgiving. I didn't have the same feeling. There was something about the house, something in the air that made me uneasy from the moment we arrived. The mansion looked like something straight out of an old Gothic novel, with its towering windows and wrought iron gates. It was isolated, far from any neighbors or roads. My parents were excited, talking about how this was a rare opportunity to reconnect with family history, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. We went inside, and it was beautiful, maybe too beautiful. The grand dining room was set with an extravagant spread, but when I looked at the table, I realized something was wrong. The table was set for more people than we had invited. There were extra places, plates, silverware, glasses, too many for just us. But it wasn't just that. It was the air, thick and heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. At first, we tried to dismiss it. It was a grand old house after all. And who wouldn't feel strange in a place so full of history? But then the sounds started. Footsteps in the hallways, faint, almost imperceptible at first. At first I thought it was my brother sneaking around, but when I looked, he was sitting at the table, as confused as I was. And the shadows. They would flicker at the edges of my vision, figures moving just out of sight, never fully coming into view. I thought it was the flickering candlelight, but every time I looked, they were gone. After dinner, I decided to explore. I couldn't sit still any longer. I walked down a long hallway that led to the back of the house. There was a door at the end, one that seemed to be locked. Curiosity got the best of me, and I found a way to open it. Inside, the room was dusty, forgotten. The walls were lined with portraits of the mansion's previous owners, their faces frozen in time. The strangest part? Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the room, as if they were alive, watching. I was about to leave when I heard something, a soft creak from downstairs. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had to go back to the dining room. And that's when I saw them. It was just after midnight, and the dining room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the candles. The table was still set, but it was no longer empty. The shadows I'd seen earlier were now seated at the table. Figures, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, sitting motionless. I couldn't see their faces, just the outline of their bodies. Their heads turned toward me, unmoving, like statues. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know if they could see me or if I was just imagining it, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't supposed to be there. I rushed out of the room and found my parents in the foyer, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They'd heard the noises too, the footsteps and the creaks. That's when the caretaker found us. He was an old man, bent and hunched, as if he'd been living in the house for far too long. He told us the story. The original owners of the estate had died right at that very table, decades ago, during a Thanksgiving dinner. They had invited guests, family, friends, just like we had. But something had gone horribly wrong. It wasn't a peaceful dinner. No, it was an accident, or perhaps something much darker. The caretaker told us that since then, the spirits of the original owners return every Thanksgiving to dine again, forever reliving that final meal. We didn't stay after that. We left that night, our car's tires crunching over the snow as we drove away. But I'll never forget those figures at the table, those motionless bodies, staring at me. I couldn't help but wonder if we had been invited too, but we just didn't know. The following year, just before Thanksgiving, we received a letter. It was handwritten, no return address. When I opened it, I could feel the cold air in the room. It was signed by the deceased. Just a short message. Thank you for joining us. We never went back to that house, not once. That estate remains in our family, but we haven't stepped foot inside since that night. And every year, as Thanksgiving approaches, I can't help but wonder, where are those spirits waiting for us? Or did we unknowingly disturb their eternal feast? These were their stories, the ones shared by Sarah, David, and Megan. But now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a Thanksgiving memory that still sends chills down your spine? Something that you can't explain? Something that haunts you long after the holiday ends? Maybe there's a shadow in the corner of your mind, or a strange noise in the house late at night. Whatever it is, we want to know. Let us know in the comments below. Did your Thanksgiving dinner take a dark turn? What happened when the guests showed up or never left? Share your stories with us, and let's see how many of us are truly alone during the holidays. If you enjoyed these unsettling tales, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell for more stories that will keep you awake at night. We've got plenty more to share, so you won't want to miss what's coming next. Until next time, stay safe, and maybe double-check your guest list this Thanksgiving. After all, good night, and be careful where you sit.